This continues an interview with George M. Massey on August 1st, 2003 in Knoxville, Tennessee with Kurt Peeler and
Bob Gracia.
And you were just saying about the division over...
Yeah, if you got, if we got in real serious contact and you had casualties, the procedure was that you had to make a request for medevac up through both channels, the Vietnamese channel and the U.S. channel. Interesting thing about this, of course, if we were in hot contact, the Vietnamese, that would be the first thing they would ask, and they would deny it. And of course, at that point, the U.S. would, they would okay it, come out and do the medevac, pick them up. Plus, the Vietnamese, and they figured this out early on, if they were picked up by the Vietnamese medevacs, so if we got them back to camp, if they were injured somehow, and it was not a hot LZ or not a hot situation, and the Vietnamese medevacs picked them up, they took them to the hospital in Saigon, which was called the Cho Lan Hospital, which is in Saigon. There's a part of Saigon called Cho Lan, and that's where the big hospital was. If they had any kind of extremity wound, they knew what was going to happen. It was an immediate amputation. They did not try to treat the wound. It was easier to treat the amputation than it was to treat the wound, either gunshot or shrapnel or whatever. Now, if they went back to the U.S. hospital, they knew they would get treated and they wouldn't have the amputation. Now, we had like I say, the Cu Chi Hospital, the 25th Infantry Division, was our overwatch, but we also had a Special Forces hospital back in Bien Hoa, which was outside Saigon. And once they got them stabilized, then they would transfer them to our hospital, and we had U.S. medics and U.S. doctors, and then of course had Vietnamese medics and doctors there that we worked in our hospital. But that was one of the little things that I didn't know this initially, but we found out, like you say, if they were evacuated to the Vietnamese hospital, an extremity wound, it was an amputation.
Were your regulars aware of this? Did they know that?
They figured it out.
Yeah, because I can imagine guys saying,
"Oh yeah,
they wouldn't want it."
Oh, they did not want to be picked up by the Vietnamese medevacs. No, they may not have known it earlier on.
Yeah.
The word got out, so to speak, and we were, like I say, the process was we had to make the double request, and I mean we just got to the point where we said, "Yeah, it's a hot LZ," and I don't know. One or two times did the Vietnamese come out. The rest of it was U.S. medevac, whether it was hot or not. Of course, they'd come on out anyway. And we usually could secure it for them enough to get them in and get it out.
Yeah.
And earlier on, this is interesting, during this time frame, this tour, the first tour, the medevacs, even just the regular helicopters flying through the area that were on a resupply mission or whatever, you could get on air to ground to them and call for help, and they would come in. They'd fly into the camp first, kind of figure out what's going on and get us some security troops to go out with them. And they would go out and make pickups. Now, they'd bring them back to the camp, and then we could get the medevac in to pick them up if it was a hot LZ. I mean, they would go into hot LZs. Of course, the medevacs had the big red cross on the side, but hell, that didn't make any difference.
Yeah.
They got shot at, But, no, it was an interesting system that we had. But, no, the troops figured it out. They did. But the first time around, like I say, the regular helicopter units were more than willing. The second time around, younger warrant officers, and I'm not saying that warrant officers didn't do a good job, but they were not as prone to go out and do that.
Mm-hmm.
If their mission was to carry supplies, going out and doing medevacs wasn't part of it.
Yeah.
So dust off, as we call it. So it was a little change the second time around. I was up in the Central Highlands.
All right. Then earlier you talked about going to unconventional warfare school. Was that before your first tour, or was that in between tours, or one?
No, that was after the Czech language at the city of Monterey, and then I went to unconventional warfare school.
What really was that?
Well, as the name implies, it was guerrilla warfare.
Okay.
Was what we were taught, and see that was en route to going to Germany with the 10th Special Forces,
okay,
where we would do unconventional type stuff. So the overall mission of the 10th, and very simple terms, I guess, is that we were stationed down in the southern Bavarian Alps, and we had target countries and target areas, so that if the balloon went up, as we say in the military, if the war started, we would be infiltrated behind the lines to set up evasion escape routes for downed pilots, to set up guerrilla bases, insurgents, Dr. Peter said, and wreak havoc on any resupply or supply lines. So we would be behind the line type stuff, guerrillas,
Okay.
unconventional warfare.
Okay.
And like I say, conversely, in Vietnam, we were on the other side of that. We were fighting the insurgents and unconventional types. Of course, still using some of our unconventional stuff.
Mhm. So then with your second tour, what really entailed that into your second tour in Vietnam?
Well, again, being,
Same
you know,
thing.
quote, being a career guy, so well, we're going to assign you to Vietnam, and didn't really know where I was going to be assigned. It was just kind of an open assignment.
Yep.
And so went into to Saigon. That's where everybody goes through, and they had greeting officers, I guess you would say, there, and they said, "Oh yeah, you're going into MACV headquarters." Well, that's the military command in Vietnam, and don't know exactly where you're going, but okay, we've got a real. It's got the needs of the service took over at this point.
Mhm.
I was not assigned to a regular line unit, so at that point, you know, if I was, say if I'd been assigned to the 25th Infantry Division or something like that, their representative would pick me out of the bunch and taking me off, and I've been with them. But this time, by this time I was a major, so they said, okay, we need majors to run teams with the Arvin Rangers. And since you're prior Special Forces, what we're doing, it was called the Border Camp Conversion. And they were converting Special Forces camps to Ranger battalions. The only thing the troops did, the CIDG, they changed color of the berets. They went from green beret to maroon beret. Now for the Americans, or the teams, most of the Special Forces guys were moved, I mean, they were getting out of country, in other words. They were withdrawing the 5th Special Forces.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, they were shutting them down. A lot of the guys, like myself, a lot of the guys that came in there were prior Special Forces or had been before, to include some of the NCOs. And they said, okay, you're going to become a Ranger advisor. And so we went out into these camps that were ex-Special Forces camps, and did the same thing, like I said earlier, with fewer people and fewer assets. So, but the overall tenor of the war had changed and was phasing down at this point.
Yeah, Vietnamization, trying to get the Vietnamese to start take over their own fight.
And of course they were withdrawing more and more. So I got assigned to Pleiku, which was what we call MR2 Ranger Command. And initially I was up there, went into a camp called Play Morong, which is a Montagnard camp. The mountain people, French for mountain people, Montagnard. Good soldiers, and they were very loyal to the Americans. The Montagnards were somewhat like the American American Indians, because they had been mistreated by the Vietnamese and had kind of been shoved off into the Central Highlands, not very well taken care of. So the Montagnards were not real keen on the Vietnamese. So when we went in there as Ranger advisors, if you will, to Ranger battalions, like I say, these guys have been Special Forces, changed the color of the beret, and now they're Rangers. You ran operations, did the same things you'd done before.
Yep.
Again, kind of as a forward force to keep, infiltration and keep units coming out. Of course, the Central Highlands was a totally different ballgame as far as terrain goes. We were not in the swamps like I was the first time around. We were up in the Central Highland, up in the mountains, triple canopy jungle and stuff like that. The level of operations was not as high. We didn't run that many. I mean, we ran operations, but we only had 4 Americans, so you really couldn't get many Americans out on the operation. And again, we're trying to get the Vietnamese to run their own show. And we coordinated the assets for them and got, support and firepower and, helicopters, stuff like that for them. So it was a little different tour, to say the least. And then, like I was saying, later on, then I got pulled down to a camp that was having some internal problems and got it squared away. And then about the last, they would usually try to bring you, quote, out of the woods the last month or two so you learn how to eat with a fork. And, we used to laugh about that, learn how to eat with a fork and learn not to pass gas at the table and stuff like that. So, but in any event, I came back up to play coup in the operations shop and worked there for the last 2 or 3 months or something like that. Again, interestingly enough, when I went into the MR2 Ranger Command there in play coup, when I got off the plane, here's a guy who had been the brigade commander at the University of Tennessee 2 years ahead of me, Tommy M. Johnson. And and I recognized him because I'm junior to him, but and he recognized me, recognized the name, and so he was the XO of this MR2 Ranger Command, and I became the S3 of the operations officer after I went out into the camps. And we were there. He was there about a month ahead of me, so we left about the same time. But Tommy and I, we had a good tour together there, so to speak. He's in the book. He was the guy that was a wheeler dealer, and still is. He's now retired, and is literally the world expert on edged weapons of the Third Reich. And he's got a business. He sells and buys daggers and swords and stuff from the Third Reich, World War II. And he's written, volumes on this. I think the last one I got was volume 7. And he goes into the description of all the different types of weapons and everything. But he's a real interesting guy. But one of the things we did, it's in the book about, we went down to get these ceramic elephants. That's a big thing. I don't know if you've seen, we've got 2 of them at home right now that we sent back, that I sent back. We call them boofies. Big ugly elephant. Big ugly fat elephant, big ugly friggin' elephant, whatever you want to put but big, that's what we call them. So we sent a plane down to near Saigon to a ceramic plant to pick up a bunch of these boofies, these big elephants. And it was a Buffalo, I forget the designation of the aircraft, but it was a Army aircraft, single engine. And we loaded this thing up and just barely got off the ground at times in the middle of this thing. Almost had a wreck, and we laughed about it. He said, boy, wouldn't that have been, how would you explain that away, that all this ceramic stuff was in this aircraft? But that's a side story. But so again, you run across people you were either in school with or had known. So the Army's a small place.
So, and then when you were done with that, you went to Command and General Staff College. Is that what happened?
Well, I came back out of Vietnam and came to Vanderbilt to go to grad school, and then with ROTC, of course, I got my graduate degree, and then taught 2 years in Army ROTC at Vanderbilt, and then was picked up for Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas.
With the no hitchhiking rule, I remember reading that in the book.
Yeah, well, good memory. You picked up on a lot of points I put in that book. At Leavenworth, of course, the federal penitentiary Leavenworth, and it was Fort Leavenworth there, which is the old cavalry post, I guess, from way back when, and that's where the Command General Staff College is located. But also in that same area is the Kansas State Women and Men's Prison. And that was the big joke. When you got there, they briefed you, and one of the things they tell you is, well, don't pick up hitchhikers around here because they might get escape convicted. But the Command General Staff year, when you went out there and you heard this all, be the best year of your life. And basically what it is the name implies, it's for officers who will be on the command and general staffs of the Army in later years. They will become the division commanders and the brigade commanders, and they'll become the top guys. It's the school right before you get to the War College. But you also learn to be on what they call the general staff, which is the G level, G3s and G2s and all that, and divisions and units like that. But the biggest thing is there was about 1,000 of us there. Each class is about 1,000 officers from all different branches.
Uh-huh.
Infantry, all the 14 branches, I guess, we've got in the military. So you had a real wide range of people there of different backgrounds and different capabilities and everything else. And of course, you were put in a work group, and then you were at a section in a work group. The work group was about 10 to 12 guys. So you really got familiar with those guys because that's where you did all your stuff. But they had facilities were really great. You had a lot of family time because you were in school, but every day your schedule was from about 8 o'clock to about 3 o'clock, and then from 3 to 5 they had on the training schedule research and development. Well, our little cul-de-sac, there were 6 of us there, and 4 of us played golf religiously. Well, our research and development was, you get out of class, and our deal was the first one that could get home, or the guys that could get out on the curb first, the last guy out of the house had to drive to the golf course. So we'd go out and play golf till dark. That was our research and development. Now, there were days, of course, that we had to do things, but we laughed about this. So they gave you a lot of, and the weekends, then you had some studying you had to do, but most of it was hands-on in the class, so that when you came to the weekend, you had time with your families, and there was a lot of social activities going on.
It sounds like, because you described earlier how the Army was not very friendly for, it was hard on families.
Yeah.
I mean, particularly a regular, and this almost sounds like the Army at this point had said, this is in part to train you, but we understand this is the time you're going to spend the weekend with your family. This is a time where you can spend some time in an afternoon and play golf and not.
Most of the schools, with the exception of the real hands-on schools like ranger schools out in the woods, jump school, and you're jumping out of planes, like the advanced course. We came back to Fort Benning to the advanced course after the first tour in Vietnam. General Wright, and there's a book, I think it's How Hell Forged a General. He was on the Bataan Death March out of the Second World War and survived it. And of course, this was in the 60s. I mean, he was still on active duty, older gentleman for sure, 68, I guess, and 2-star general. And he got up in front of us and he said, "Gentlemen," he said, "we have looked at this class." There were, I don't know, 150 of us in the class, I guess, maybe 200 in the advanced class. He said, 99.6% of you have been to Vietnam. And at the end of this year, it was about a year-long course, he said, at the end of this year, 99.6 of you will go back to Vietnam. Of course, we immediately said, where's that 0.4%? Why the hell aren't they? Why did they go to Vietnam yet? That kind of became the joke. But basically, he said, enjoy this year with your, and so the point you're making is well taken.
There was, there was some sense that this was not completely accidental.
And now that may have been General Wright, but his pitch was, guys, enjoy your families, enjoy your downtime, as we would call it, because at the end of this thing, most of you are going back to Vietnam, because this was 68 time frame, and Vietnam wasn't going to go away, it didn't look like. So with Command General Staff, of course, we didn't have the Vietnam thing going on, but basically it was a year to really, it was also a year to make some new friends and learn your contemporaries and know that these are the guys that are eventually going to be running the Army. I never thought I was, and of course I didn't, but some of the guys, for instance, one of the guys who was in the first Desert Storm was the division commander of the 24th Infantry Division, Barry McCaffrey.
Oh yes,
Who eventually became
the drug czar.
But Barry was a classmate of mine at Command General Staff College. We were in the same section together. Bright guy. He was a class of 64, I guess, West Point. Bright guy. He had 3 Distinguished Service Crosses, so he had been there. and done that, as they say. And unfortunately, he had a gimpy arm. He got wounded real bad. He basically had no use of his left arm, but just a real brilliant guy. So and there was others. Wayne Downing, who just recently was called back into active duty to do some. He was a 4-star general, I think. Barry retired as a 3-star. He got out when he became the drug czar. And, of course, Barry's been on the.
Yeah, he's has a whole nother career.
Yeah, he's been up with some of the when this war stuff's going on. But in any event, so those are the kind of people that you met at Command General Staff College. As it ended up, Barry and I ended up in the same division, 3rd Infantry Division, over in Germany, and he was a contemporary of mine, but he was a little junior in rank at that point. And when I left as battalion XO of the battalion, executive officer of the infantry battalion, he replaced him because he was up in the division staff, and he came down, and I went on up to USARA staff, which is the United States Army Europe Command up in Heidelberg, because I got promoted to lieutenant colonel. So I moved on up into a higher level. Of course, it was a G staff. I was in the G3 at USARA and dealt with a lot of operations stuff at the USARA headquarters, which controlled all the units there in Europe. So that, you just run into people like that, and you keep crossing them and keep meeting them.
Yeah.
And he eventually, like I say, ended up being division commander during Desert Storm, first Desert Storm.
And then when you were just talking about in Germany, was that when we read in the book the return of forces to Germany kind of thing? Is that
the reforger type thing. Of course, that had been going on for years, but we at the USARA level staff, we kind of got involved. Well, we got involved with it directly. Of seeing we'd bring units over to test, if you will, the ability to bring a unit from the States in a hurry, and they would come over and pick up their equipment there in Europe, and then go out on maneuvers and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But one of the things I worked on after I left the battalion down in Schweigfurt, Germany, went up to Heidelberg, and I worked at Heidelberg. I was there about a year, I guess, before I got reassigned out back to the States, but we ended up, I worked on a handbook for NATO operations. And the interesting thing about this was as the name implies, it was a handbook to say, okay, this is how the Americans do it, this is how the Belgians do it, this is how the British do it, and this is how the Germans do it. Now the French were kind of out there. They had by this time pulled out of NATO, so we didn't work with them much. The Dutch, to work with the Dutch. So what my job was, and me and another lieutenant colonel, we were pulling together all these tactics, if you will, or procedures of the way we did it and the way they did it, and put it into a handbook so that if we got attached to a Dutch unit, we could kind of figure out how they do things, the terminology. The biggest problem we had with terminology was between the English and the Americans. Because their terminology, you think, well, we all speak English. No, we speak American, they speak, that's the joke. And that was some of the more fun meetings I had, was to go up to a place called München, I don't know if that's the correct pronunciation, Mönchengladbach, is where the British were located, their headquarters. And we'd go up to do some coordinating meetings with them. And the British are a funny bunch to work with. And they still do, they don't start, they start 9 o'clock in the morning, they break for lunch, and they have a little tea time, and they work late in the evening. And then they go over to the club, and it's coat and tie, and they're very, they're very traditional about the way they do their mess, if you will, they call it. But, and they said, you Americans, said, we could put you on a desert island, put a chain link fence around you, and within a month you would have it filled with paperwork. They did not like paperwork. The Americans are just notorious for that. So that was one of the things.
They really comment that was a point
Oh, yeah.
of the paperwork.
Yeah, they just said, you guys, everything's got to be in triplicate. I mean, And it may have been a little bit of being a little facetious, but yeah, they were very laid back about it. And like I say, they had their little tea and crumpets in the afternoon. But one of the tales in the book was about the two colonels that regaled me about just various and sundry things. But the one, says, they brought our food to us, and the one tasted it, and the other one says, in World War II, that's how the Nazis figured out British spies. So we have a propensity to taste our food and then salt it. And the other one looked around, I think we're quite safe now. British humor, and I just thought, but they had regaled me with these two guys. They were older British colonels.
They had been in World War. It sounded like they had been in.
Well,
if not quite World War II,
but they
had definitely been of that era too.
But they had been, as they say, posted. They're not assigned. They're posted all around the world, and one of them had been posted over in Borneo, I guess. And the tale on it, his friend was telling, says he was in a hotel with a little bird. They call them birds, a little girl, and the hotel caught on fire, and he, shows him carrying, and the picture was on the front page of one of the London papers. It says Major so-and-so is rescued. And he said, hell yeah, he rescued. He was carrying his girl of the evening out with him, and the other guy knew about it. And said, so they told me that tale. It was funny working with the British, but that was one of the things I did with in Europe after I got over there.
I'm pretty much done with my questions, so if you want to do...
Yeah, well, you had this. You raised an interesting point about comparisons of hardship, which I
kind of brought it up. I was off the record, but are we on now?
Yeah, we're on now. Yeah.
Well, what I was saying is that in my day and time, if you will, we had the turbulence of Vietnam. Year tour, back school, back to Vietnam, and that was tough on the families. It was tough for a career guy, for sure. But it was accepted. My wife today. I'll say this, and she doesn't mind me saying it. When she sees a news program where they're interviewing the wives, he's been gone for 3 months, she doesn't have any sympathy for him. Mm-hmm. Said, hey, this is an all-volunteer force we got. Mm-hmm. That's the one thing. See, back then we had draftees, and we had a bigger force, so you could spread that wealth out a little bit as to how many tours you have. And now it's an all-volunteer force. And when you sign on and you raise your right hand to support and defend the Constitution against all enemy, foreign and domestic, that's what it means.
Yep.
Now, if you get called on and you have to go over, hey, it's a tough, and I feel for them. And the point I was making is that we've had such a drawdown. Mm-hmm. But these guys are starting to meet themselves coming and going, and we're trying to be the world policeman. At some point, we're going to have to back out of that.
Well, the other thing that I've been struck at, and I'd be curious your comments is, in World War II, guys fought for the duration. You were in until you got wounded, you got killed, or the war was over.
The war was over. Yeah.
And then in Korea and Vietnam, we do the rotation, which is in part, so guys don't get demoralized by the only way to get out is to get killed or wounded, or maybe we'll win, at some point. But the Army sort of moved back to the disadvantage of the rotation is, you don't go over as units. You lose the unit cohesiveness. And I've been struck in this current Gulf War is that in many ways we've had units came over, but the problem now is we need these units overseas, and we're sort of butting up to the problem of not having a rotation system that guys have to stay because their unit is needed.
Yeah, the unit is needed there, and there's no one there to replace them.
Yeah.
I talked to a young lieutenant, as a matter of fact, down at Fort Gordon back in the spring, and he said, and I've read this since then, and I didn't think about it till he brought it out. He said, I was assigned, I think he was military intelligence officer. He said, I was assigned to a unit, went over, did, the preliminary work, was sent back to the States. My rotation was over. He said, I was reassigned to units that's getting ready to go back. And he said, now I get back to the States, and a young black officer, matter of fact. And he said, I'm not sure if I get back on this rotation that I'm not going to get out. And that was the point I think we're going to really run into a problem here if we don't get some kind of relief for these guys, because some of them have been in Bosnia,
Mm-hmm.
they've been in Afghanistan, they come back home and now they're in Iraq. I mean, it's
What's interesting about this question of rotations, because
yeah.
and I feel like putting this on record because I've even told my class about the current Canadian Army. When the university had a Normandy semester, we were with a Canadian group was with us on their Normandy program, and at one point they gave us a little battle tour for the UT group, and they did such a nice job. And I said, you know what? And it was also for my benefit. I said, tell us a little about the Canadian Army today. And he said how small of a force he is and how much they're trying to do. And he said, basically, we have 6 brigades. And because of all this peacekeeping, all these duties, and also that he says we were with the Americans in, Kosovo, and he's going on all their mission. He says, basically 2 brigades are going overseas, 2 brigades are coming home, and 2 are sort of here, and they're you're constantly moving. So the average Canadian officer is 6 months home, 6 months there, and I thought, my God, what a
that's tough.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing, and of course, like I say, with Vietnam, you knew if you left here on September the 1st, unless you got shot up or whatever, next year on September the 1st, you would be pretty close to getting on a plane and coming home. I mean, that's unless you volunteered to stay over there.
Yeah.
So.
Because I guess the question I would have is, did the people who thought they wanted to be regulars change their mind during Vietnam? Did you ever sense guys you knew, fellow officers, who just said, I just can't, I don't want, I want off this?
Yeah.
I mean, because I think it must have really separated those who really wanted.
There were those who, like you say, were regulars, and of course we were not a quote volunteer force that time.
Yes, no, they were
although the officers were for
yeah,
the most part.
for the most part.
Of course, a lot of them, got on active duty and then went OCS, and that was a little different thing. But say for the ROTC guy or the
Yeah.
academy graduate, whatever, there were those who, when they ended their tour, says, "This is it, I'm getting out." So we did, but. For the most part, if you survived a year in Vietnam, you knew, hey, I'm coming back to either a school or assignment to a unit that's not tabbed to go, because then it was all individual replacement time.
Yeah.
See? So you knew, hey, I can go into division. I should be there for at least 2 years, 3 years, whatever, unless things really get whacked. For instance, I came back, let's see, I went in, get my years straight. I went in 66, came back in 67. So I was home 67, 68, 69, and then finally got back over in 70. But in part of that, I was in schools.
Yeah.
So I would have gone back in probably 69 had I not gone to the language school.
Yeah.
So there was good, because I was infantry, and that was where that's where, and there's a lot of guys in my contemporary age group who had the one tour, artillery or ordnance or. So it was not quite the same, because we had this big army. A guy could get reassigned to Europe, and he knew, man, I won't be here because they're not going to brag him out of Europe for 3 years or whatever, if he was an ordnance guy or whatever. But they did stay in time, and I told Bob a while ago, I can't remember our manning level. It was well over 1 million force. In the Army, when I was on active duty, now it's down to what? I don't know. 500,000 or is it?
I just know at one point the statistic always sticks in mind is that we had 500,000 troops in Germany during that, at the height, and now
we don't even have that many probably in the total force.
Yeah.
Because I know some guys that I've talked to have been to Europe and talking about how everything is shut down, and in the NATO structure we're starting to turn that over to the Europeans and shut down a lot of our bases over there. And drawing back because we've had to. We just have so many people. So, yeah, it's a different. I think we're really running a risk of losing a lot of good folks if we don't get something on this rotation thing. It was interesting the other day. I watched the C-SPAN interview, if you will, or they had the new Army Chief of Staff having his hearings. General Schoemaker. That was one of the points that was brought out about, you've got these troops who are riding home, you've got the families who are complaining, and what are you going to do about that, General? Of course, about all he could say, well, we're going to study it and be sensitive to it and try to come up with a plan, but I don't. It's going to be tough. It's going to be tough.
Well, I have a feeling that we're definitely going to want to do a follow-up with you at some point. I have a new graduate assistant probably coming out in a year who specializes in Vietnam, so it might be a while, but I want to go way back because I have a bunch of follow-up, and so I'm going way back. This is sort of growing up. When did your family get television? Do you remember?
What?
You've talked a lot about radio, because radio left quite an impression, and movies, but when did television...
We had an aunt.
So that was your first...
that lived in town, and this had to be, well, I was still in high school, so it had to be mid-50s. And the big treat for us was to go into town, go to the movies on Saturday afternoon, and Saturday night, we would go down to Aunt Mary's and watch whatever, Uncle Milty, I think, Milton Earl was one of the first programs. But that was it. It was black and white, not much bigger than a monitor screen. But we would all sit there. But when I'd already left home. I mean, I'd left home.
So you didn't have television?
Didn't have television while I was at home, no.
So you left home in 58?
Left home in 58. So I don't know when our folks got it.
So you really didn't you didn't really grow up with television?
Nope. Even when we came to UT, as a student, we didn't have television set.
Mm-hmm.
Not early on. We may have gotten later, but I'm sitting here trying to think. My wife could tell you for sure, because I don't remember stuff like that. But I don't think we had a TV. I don't think we had a TV when I was in school. I think we got on active duty Army before you
actually had a TV.
And it was black and white. I don't even remember when color came in. But yeah.
Could you also, you've talked, earlier you talked a good bit about ROTC and how valuable it was. Mm-hmm. Could you talk a little bit about summer camp, between your junior and senior?
Yeah. We had, well, like I say, we went to Fort Benning, Georgia in the middle of the summer. I mean, it was blazing hot, and we lived, of course, that was not uncommon even up into after I got on active duty. We still had the World War II billets, the old two-story billets that were built, to last for 4 years or 5 years till the end of World War II. And here we are in 59, 59, 60, or 61, and they're still using it. And when I got on active duty, I went back to Fort Benning. We still use those old War II. But anyhow, it was interesting in that you were thrown in with a bunch of guys from different schools, and I remember, of course, we'd all had essentially the same training. I mean, most of the ROTC programs back then it was all mandatory in the state schools or the land-grant schools, and then you had the Citadel graduates that were there, who were military schools, and then you had North Georgia Military College, and we didn't have any. Of course, West Pointers didn't go to summer camp. They had their own thing going. So you had those kind of guys, but you had guys who were athletes. You had guys who were fraternity guys. You had guys who were engineers. I mean, you had a wide range of people. So consequently, you got to, and some of these guys I served with. I mean, they stayed on active duty, and I ran into them in later years. But our cadre, the officers were ROTC instructors who were doing their summer duty down at Fort Benning, Georgia. And very seldom would you have one of your cadre members. In other words, I wouldn't have a UT instructor. I'd have some guy who was, our guy actually was from the University of Florida, I believe. But this was also the first time that I remember being put into a situation with blacks. Because we had Florida A&M, which was all black school. We had Tuskegee Institute. What was one or two of the other black schools? But anyway, we had a fairly large number.
I guess Tennessee State would be one.
Tennessee State. Well, were they there then?
I'm just trying to think of black schools that might have been.
Tuskegee and Florida A&M
those
for sure were the two. And Grambling. Oh, that's right. We had some from Grambling and Lincoln.
And what about North Carolina? I guess it's North Carolina A&T.
There might, yeah, I'd have to. I've got my old
Yeah, but
camp book, but in any event, that was the first time. So you ended up being not thrown in, but you had blacks there, and it never bothered me because I was not. I mean, you know, hey, they're put into position. Of course, you rotated what we call the cadet chain of command. You know, one day you'd be a platoon leader, one day you'd be a private. Next day you'd be a company commander. You know, they rotated that around it to give you experience and the frustrations of command, as they say. Some of the guys had problems when the blacks were in charge.
I mean, this was summer of '61.
61.
I mean, this is the height of the civil rights movement in the South. I mean, that's summer of the freedom rides.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Well, we had, talking about freedom rides, I had a lieutenant I served with over in Germany, old Bo Young, big black lieutenant, made captain, went to Vietnam with him. But old Bo went to Grambling. He was a football player, big kid. And he said, I tell you what, said, I got on one of those freedom rides, and I'll use the terms that he used. He said, they came in those buses from up in Illinois and New York. Said them Jewish, he called them Jewish. Those Jewish girls said they came in there and said, you know, man, they blinked those eyes at us. Said you ought to come on, ride us right down. So came down to Georgia, and he said we came and stopped right outside of Stone Mountain, Georgia. And he said the next thing I know, he said some big old white guys grabbed me off that bus, put an iron on my shoulder, a damn branding iron, and branded me and said, son, you don't ever come back to Georgia. And he said, I broke loose from them. I mean, he's a big, strong guy. There must have been some good guys over him. I mean, and he was telling his tale. I mean, it was just a matter of fact. And he said, I took off running, and he said, I got to a place I could call my mama. And said, I ain't never coming back to the South. But he ended up down at Fort Benning, Georgia, and he also ended up going to Fort Bragg in the Special Forces. And then he, you know, by this, we were talking mid-'60s by then, you know, or, you know, after the early '60s. But he said, oh, yeah. He said, man, they branded him right out in Stone Mountain, Georgia, right outside of Atlanta. But the way he talked about it, said those Jewish girls came in on those buses, those freedom rides. So that was the time frame we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, because you're going, this is the era, I mean, this is even before desegregation of Ole Miss. You're having students from Ole Miss.
Oh, yeah.
With students from, say, Grambling.
Yeah, and it was, you know, you could see that was not a good mesh.
How were the cadre handling that? I mean, how did the military do that? I mean, I'm curious because, particularly given the time.
Well, as a student or you know, as a cadet,
yeah,
you know, if they said jump, you jump. And,
yeah,
and the cadre were meshed together. I would assume, and I don't know this, but I would assume that the black schools had black cadre.
Yeah.
I don't think they had the cadre mixed together.
Yeah. But they're in summer camp, they're all mixed.
They're all together.
Yeah.
And I remember I can remember some of the black officers, and you know, they were professional. I mean, they just, hey, we got a job to do.
Yeah.
We're going to train you.
So the cadre, you didn't sense a division among the.
No.
Like if there was tension, the cadre, you couldn't tell that.
No.
But among your fellow students.
It really dissipated though. By the time you got thrown together, and a week or two later, you saw that, hey, these guys are trying to do. Like I say, it never bothered me. You know, hey, and as a matter of fact, we had cubicles in those big World War II billets. There was double bunk here and a double bunk here. So, and the guy on the bottom over here was from Florida A&M. Now he was prior service. And of course, he was a font of knowledge because he knew how to fit shine boots. He knew how to make beds. He knew how to cut the corners, and clean the latrines and stuff because he had been there as a private. So we gravitated to him. I can't remember his name.
But he was really.
Oh yeah. So everybody, and he kind of became, for our little part of the platoon, I guess. You know, we were with our platoon. And he was kind of the font of knowledge, and hey, let's go talk to you know, he'll give us.
Yeah, he'll tell you how to do it.
Yeah, he'll tell us how to do it. There were those, like you say, like the Mississippi schools and some of the other schools. It was but by the end of camp, I think it had all dissipated.
Yeah,
Now, when I came back to Fort Benning, or when I got to Fort Benning, Georgia in '62, or actually in '63, I guess, and the riot started in Mississippi, and at Ole Miss and Tuskegee, we were on alert for, and some of the our particular unit, my battalion did not have to go, but some of the units out of Fort Benning did come over, and of course we would do the riot control training. The bayonets fixed, and you get in a V and you move forward. And I'm looking at my platoon, and we were probably 50% black. And we had discussions about this with our units. We said, folks, we're the United States Army. If we're sent over there to do this mission, we're not going to become black and white. We are United States Army. We all understand that. We're not going to break ranks and run. And we had black NCOs, and they said, yeah. They took, they kind of put it out to the black troops. Hey, this ain't our fight other than the fact that we get over there, but we're going to go in and control things. Fortunately, our unit never had to go, so I don't know how that would have worked out. But the units that went, there was no breaking of the ranks.
No, I mean, actually, we're having a historian for Celebrate Freedom, William Doyle, is going to talk about Ole Miss and the military units that served.
They did their job, and that's kind of how it worked out.
So no one was washed out that you knew of from your summer camp because they couldn't do it. Did you know, did you any? You mentioned there was tension. Was there any fights or anything that, or was more?
Yeah, there may. But they kept us so damn busy. It really didn't.
But you're conveying a sense of it. It was very clear in the beginning. This air of tension for some.
Yeah, but it dissipated.
Yeah.
But as far as washing out of summer camp, there may, and I'm trying to think back in our particular unit,
it's also
I don't know we had any that washed out, and I'm sure there were some in camp where people got hurt, things like that.
I'm curious. Your parents were Democrats, which is not surprising from Middle Tennessee.
Mm-hmm.
Where were you in, say, the early '60s? Let's say in the '60 election. You couldn't vote. I don't think you could. You couldn't vote because you were not 21.
21.
But who were you leaning toward, Nixon or Kennedy?
Kennedy. I was probably a Kennedy Democrat. But and as being a historian more so than I am, he was probably more conservative than most of the conservatives today. I mean.
In some ways. On a lot of issues.
And of course, when he was elected and then he started his term, of course, he was very pro-military and having, so I probably was leaning to Kennedy. Through the years, of course, I probably have become a conservative Republican, but I'll vote for the man.
Yeah.
More so than, but there again, if I feel like if he's for the things I'm for, then that's who I'll vote for. But that's one of the things I've never missed an election.
Since you could vote.
I mean, absentee, whatever I had to do, because I felt like, hey, and I don't know if you can vote yet or not, but when you get the opportunity, by God, you better vote, because that's one of our basic freedoms. And the others, and of course you've heard this argument. He said, if you don't vote, then you really don't have anything to say about it, or you can't express your opinion about the guy that's in there because you didn't vote one way or the other. But that's kind of.
Now, you had talked earlier about reporting to your first unit, and you had no advanced training. I mean, you had ROTC was your training.
Yeah.
And you talked very warmly about your first lieutenant was not. You didn't think it would be. You conveyed the sense it became a warm relationship, but it was the least when you the first day.
First day.
And a very.
What have I gotten myself into?
And you very close relationship with your sergeant.
Yes.
What else do you remember about being a young second lieutenant?
Well, just, for instance, I got into the unit, or got into Fort Benning on Tuesday, got to the unit on Wednesday. The next Monday, we went to the field for a 2-week operation. And we went down and drew APCs, Armored Personnel Carriers, which at that time were the old M79s or M59s, the M59s, the big ones, not the 113s, and of course they've got the Bradleys now, but anyway, I drew these big hulks of metal, and we had nobody in our unit that could drive them. So they had assigned drivers with them, and these guys were attached to us, and they drove the Armored Personnel Carriers. And we went to the field on a maneuver against as a matter of fact, the division, 2nd Infantry Division at that time, and we maneuvered against the National Guard group that they brought to Fort Benning to do their summer training. So we were out there for about 2 weeks. And I guess the thing that number one, that first day that I conducted the PT formation, because I was the newest lieutenant in the company, and the others had been there a while. That, I think, looking back on it, was probably the best thing that ever happened. Because I got up there, and of course I sounded off like I had a set, and I knew what I was doing, and took them on a run, and just, I think they go, man, this lieutenant's not bad. Then I got a hold of my platoon, and of course my platoon sergeant was an old style platoon sergeant, and he, ran the platoon. And that's basically what he told me. He said, Lieutenant, just stay out of my way and watch. And
well, that's the advice that
Yeah.
I mean, countless World War II young lieutenants said.
Yeah.
They were told or they learned, just follow the sergeant.
Follow the sergeant. So we get out into the field, and I was fairly good at orienteering and map reading and all that. So we never got lost. I mean, that's the first thing. You get your unit lost, and the man, he doesn't know what he's doing, that type thing. And we maneuvered real well and did okay with it, and then got back in, and it just kind of, progressed from there. Plus, and I think back on it, it was probably not, although it did kind of set the tone. When we got back in from the field, then, of course, we had to clean up, get everything put away. And then I guess we had a Saturday morning inspection, and it was a full field layout, because you'd come out from the field, cleaned your gear up, then you're going to have an inspection of it, make sure everything's clean, and you got all your web gear and all that stuff done up. And there was a very set routine. You had to put your ID card here, and your dog tags here, and all. Everything had to be lined up just so, and your foot lockers and wall lockers and all that stuff. Well, I was not, and never was, much of a spit and polish, inspection type guy. But in any event, I walked in, it was about 10 o'clock on Saturday morning, and the first bunk, it looked like somebody slept on it. It was screwed up.
Yeah, it was really not just those.
And I'm sitting there thinking, the platoon sergeant said, we're ready for inspection, sir. And there's old Sergeant Cleveland. And I guess he'd been told by the squad leader, hey, we're ready for inspection, sir, all this. It came up the chain. And I walk in there, and I took that bunk and turned it over. Just pitched it in the floor. And of course, I've got a fairly loud voice, and I kicked it up a few octaves, and I said, I'll be back at 1 o'clock when you get this blankety blank shit house straightened out. And left. So at 1 o'clock, and I didn't go a minute sooner. At 1 o'clock I walked in. You could have eaten off the floor. You could have bounced $50 off the tops. And that's about the only time I ever had to do that.
And after that was.
So it just became and I never really asked the soldiers to do anything I wouldn't do. As far as the physical stuff and being up and being ready to go and doing all that stuff, and tried to lead by example, if you will. And I think a lot of that came right back to Kaplan Lazelle here at the University of Tennessee on being physically prepared.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, then not too soon after that, then I went off to the basic course, and of course then learned more of the ins and outs of supposedly how you're supposed to be a platoon leader and all that stuff, and some of the tactics and everything. And then got back to the unit and immediately we went to the field, and I came back and went to jump school. And then right after that, we got ready to start going to Europe. And of course, we all kind of grew in that situation together. And once we got into Europe, and it's kind of interesting to talk about me raising Cain with my platoon, or that first bunk. We had a Saturday inspection. We had a new company commander, Captain Kennedy. And we'll forget it. He was a good guy. But he came into we were in old World War II billets, German billets. So you had squadrons. You weren't all in the same platoon back.
Yeah.
So you had to individually go to the squad room and inspect. Well, we walked into the first one, and they looked pretty good. Well, my demeanor was not real good. And I was kind of, like, we got to get through this. It's a Saturday morning, and he picked up on it right away. We went on through the inspections, and he pointed out a few things, and I was kind of taking notes. And as soon as we hit the hallway after the fourth squad, he said, "Lieutenant Massey, get to my office." And he said it, "Get to my office." And yes, sir. So I wheel on down, and he followed me up, and he slammed the door behind him, and he chewed my ass. And it was my demeanor.
Because you were just not taking this.
He's, and I mean, the platoon looked good. I mean,
yeah.
But it was my demeanor. And he says, "Don't you ever display that in front of me again," which I never did. But it was a lesson learned.
Yeah.
Hey, if you got an inspection,
because you mentioned it's indicating you tell that it's interesting you tell that story because you said you're really not a spit and polish.
No.
Where I think there's some officers. There's a memoir I read, and I actually wrote a foreword to of someone who went to OCS at the height of the Vietnam War, and he said there was a group of these junior officers who was obsessed with spit and polish. I mean, just obsessed. I mean, to the point where their senior officers were saying, "This is, we don't want people standing all night spit and polishing."
That was never my forte. There's a French officer, Jean Lategui. I'll have to paraphrase it, but basically he says if it was mine to have, we would have two armies. One to stand the parades, shine the boots, kiss the colonel's hemorrhoids. And he goes through all this, and then we would have one who would dress up in the camouflage and fight the war. I mean, that's paraphrasing, but I thought, I've always kind of, Jean would be my type of guy.
Your first... You stayed with this unit a long time, and you mentioned like the unit grew. Could you sort of explain that a bit more? About
the first division unit?
Yeah.
Well, I was there about 2 years.
Yeah, 2 years. So you got, and that's a...
Yeah. And like I say, when I volunteered to go to Special Forces, when I, quote, got out of the unit, we had a lot of, thinking back on that 2 years with that division, which was a, quote, stateside tour, we were gone. Physically, of course, 9 weeks of that I was in Ranger School, so I was gone for that. And then we were together in Europe, and then when we got back, we went on, after I got back, I got back from Ranger School, and about a week later we went on a big maneuver over in South Carolina, North Carolina, the 82nd and 101st Airborne Division, the 2nd Infantry Division, and the 5th Mechanized Division were trucked in from Texas or somewhere. And we went freewheeling across the countryside. I mean, you couldn't do that in this day and time. And, I mean, we walked through people's farms, and of course now we were told, don't tear up stuff, don't go raping and pillaging and plundering. But when you move those kinds of units and those kind of people and vehicles, you're going to tear up some stuff. But basically, we ran operations against each other for about 2 weeks.
In open, much like the World War II maneuvers.
Yes, exactly. And I know, and one of the guys I talk about, Don Perdue, who was a West Point graduate, we met literally. His platoon was securing a road junction, and my platoon was sent out to overcome, the road junction. We had our little battle, Well, of course, in these situations, you have umpires that'll come out and say, okay, you had this, you had that, you had this, you had that. And we kind of got off to the side, and I said, I called for artillery. We did this, we did that. Well, the company commanders came out, and they got involved. and the two lieutenants just went, we went over and literally sat under a shade tree and said, well, where are you from? Well, I'm from Nebraska. Where are you? I'm from Tennessee. And we became friends. I mean, literally, in about
Because
period, because the company commanders will argue who won the battle. And, at this point, I mean, we were out and dirty and tired and everything else. Well, we ended up, Don and I ended up in the language school together, taking the Czech language. And then we went to Germany together. And then we were in Vietnam together. And we had ended up, his last tour and my last tour, we were professors of military science. I was at Eastern Washington University, and he was at the University of Nevada, Reno.
Oh, it's relatively.
So we had a lot of cross, and
but the first sort of meeting was at this.
First meeting was in this, and the point I make in the book, I think about that is that we were playing war, and it was not that long after we were both in Vietnam. Yeah, it was a little different.
Now you volunteered for Special Forces.
Yeah.
When did you join? You went to Fort Bragg? When did you go to Bragg for your?
Well, the first year after I volunteered for this, I was telling you about I was sitting at the 2nd Infantry Division, and the G1 called down and said, your name's on a list.
Yes.
Airborne Ranger qualified. Do you want to go to Special Forces? And I said yes, and we'll send you to language school. You take Spanish, and then we'll send you to Panama. Well,
Yes.
So the next day I called him back and I said, well, can I go to Europe? Germany. Well, yeah, we'll send you to language school and you'll take Czech. And so I get a set of orders. So I go to the Czech language first out of Presidio Monterey with Don Perdue and another guy by the name of Jules Bonavolonta. Now, Jules is one of the ones that got out. And he became the agent in charge of the FBI in New York City. So that was how because he had always said he grew up in the New Jersey area. And he had, I can't remember the town, but in any event, he said, one of these years, he knew he was not going to stay on active duty. He said, but I'm going to get in the FBI, and I'm going to go back and fight the mafia in New York.
That was his.
And he did that.
Yeah.
And Jules Bonavolonta, he wrote a book called Good Guys, Bad Guys.
Interesting. And that was what he was telling you, right?
Yeah, I mean, this was early on. As a matter of
did he
fact,
say why he was so determined?
I was going to tell you the story behind it. His dad was a tailor. And he says, I remember as a kid that they tried to shake him down. And I don't know, I can't remember the town he was, there was some kind of pressure by the mafia.
Yeah.
And Jules said, I've always thought, he's Italian as he could be, Bonavolonta. I mean, you could get much more Italian. And he said, here are these guys coming in trying to shake my dad down. And he said, as far as I know, he wouldn't be shaken down, but he was harassed. And Jules said, I'm gonna fight against that. So he went through ROTC. He was great at Rutgers, as a matter of fact.
Oh, okay.
As a matter of fact. Rutgers is where he went to school. And he got on active duty, volunteered for Special Forces, and got all that training. And then when he completed his tour in Vietnam and completed his requirements, he got into the FBI. So, but anyhow, that's how I got into Special Forces. And when I went to the unconventional warfare school, was afterwards on my way to Germany, we went to Fort Bragg.
Okay, so that's where you got, in a sense, the Green Beret.
Yeah.
So what year was that on your way to Germany? Just
it would have been 64.
So you joined the Green Berets really when they're
just really started.
Just started. Students, I think, I always try to remind people, my students, that the Kennedy brothers are often thought of the Peace Corps, but they were also very much Special Forces.
Kennedy quote gave us the Green Beret.
Yeah, I mean Robert was picking out the equipment. I mean, he was going over the What was your that you mentioned? I think it was off the record before we get started taping. There was a lot of controversy. The Green Berets became very controversial in general. But the Army was also very leery of the Green Berets. How much did you sense of that in the 64, 63, 64?
Early on, not that much, but when Vietnam kicked up, it became, and there's no way that I can say prove this, and there's other guys in my same situation that feel the same way. I think the fact that I got into Special Forces when I did and had that on my record was probably a detriment, ultimately, to my record or to my career.
Yeah.
Because you get painted with the same brush.
Yeah.
Early on in Vietnam, and I think we did a good job, and as far as I know, the majority did a good job. But there were those who did not. They became enamored with we're the big tough Green Berets, and I think a lot of the regular line units did not like that, and the fact that we did get maybe some assets that they felt like we shouldn't have, and there was just that attitude that a lot of guys portrayed, that a lot of the regular, when I say regular Army, of course I was regular Army because I
Yeah.
the regular units,
Yeah.
in and out of it. But I think we really got a black eye in Vietnam, and then there was some of the assassination stuff that happened in Vietnam, and the special elite forces, a lot of the leaders just didn't say, hey, this is not what we want.
Well, one of the things that struck me about understanding the original concept of the Green Berets, and your career in some ways very much is a model for it in terms of, is that what my understanding is the Kennedy brothers wanted to be very special troops in the sense, not just physically elite, that was, but also that they had the language abilities, they had advanced first aid, that they could do this in a very sort of
Peace Corps manner.
And also stealth, that that it was not just force, it was also, you could speak the language, you could go into village, you could separate the enemy from the non-enemy.
Well, we use the term, and I think they still use it, we would become force multipliers. In other words, you could take the regular Special Forces team in a what we call unconventional warfare setting. You could split the team if you wanted to, because you had the commo, the medic, the demolitions, the weapons, the intel, and op, those 5 major areas. You had 10 NCOs, you had a captain, you had a lieutenant. So you could split the team, go out and organize, train, and develop an insurgent force. So you could become what we call a force multiplier behind the lines. And that was the ultimate and the overall mission, if you will, Special Forces when I got in. Well, it changed with Vietnam, and then it's kind of fine-tuned and changed through the years, and now, like in Iraq, they were sent in way early before anybody got on the ground.
Yeah.
As the human intel, or to, kind of figure out who's where and what's what, and that kind of, Afghanistan especially. So, but at the same time, they've been sent on missions, to go in to rescue people, go in and do these, quote, difficult jobs that the average troop has not had the training to do.
Yeah.
And I think that's what the overall. So consequently, more and more people are saying, well, this is a pretty worthwhile organization to have running. But in the Vietnam time frame, as Vietnam was drawing down, we were not considered that way.
Well, I'm struck though in terms of the Army, because I've read about the tension within the Army. Yeah. But what's striking to me also is in popular culture, the Green Berets, that was very distinctive to, and I think of that song in '65, fighting
John Wayne and all.
And then
that.
the movie, but
yeah.
people, I also tell my students who Vietnam is really interested is, there was a #1 pro-war song in '65 to the Green Berets. I mean, this is. What did you think of this at the time? Both the song and the people actually knew about the Green Berets.
Well, of course, we were in it.
Yeah, you were in it.
So, and I say this not in any. I went home. For instance, I go back home. Guys I'd gone to school with, old high school guys, and of course they knew I was in the military, and it came about, and he said, well, yeah, I'm in the Special Forces. Well, the term Special Forces still didn't register.
That didn't mean anything.
That could have been Special Services, taking care of the basketballs and tennis court. And I said, Special Forces? He said, oh, yeah. And I said, yeah, I work at the Green Beret. Immediately. I mean, just like, God, you're a mean son of a bitch, aren't you? I said, I'm the same guy that I always was. I've just had a lot of training. But that was the perception. Oh, well, you're a mean guy, aren't you? And that was the attitude that a lot of the Special Forces guys started portraying. Well, I'm this big, mean, macho thing. And that was never my,
Well, that and what's striking is
like
that had been the conception of the of when they established it. It was in fact not just physically tough, but also, to have language abilities to go into villages. That's also a level of very intellectual.
Yeah, I mean, you couldn't be and a lot of the NCOs that got into it earlier on. I don't know how to say this, be delicate with it, but I think they were pulled into it by the aura of, oh, we're big, put this beret on and I'm a world beater. Well, no, you're not. A good 45 will bring you down like it will anybody.
Yeah.
And so I think through the years that has turned, so now you do have these very professional, very well trained, very capable individuals that are elite, if you will. And we were, at that time, probably as elite as you could get. And I know Bob asked about the Navy SEALs. I mean, they were an elite group at that point in their little realm, but we were all fragmented.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're joint. We're Special Operation Forces, SOF, as they call them. And they're all under one big umbrella. And I think that's been a good thing.
I once did an interview with a World War II veteran who ended up General Croson. And we mainly focused on World War II, but I asked him a little bit about Vietnam, and one of his comments was about Vietnam was initially that in many ways he thinks it was an extremely professional force. The forces that went in 64, 65, 60, 67 was a very professional army. He said, in fact, he was far better than Korea and even World War II in a lot of ways. That this was a really an army ready to go. That the problems only emerge as Vietnam lengthens. What's yours? He was at that time a much higher. I think when Vietnam started, he was at mid-60s. He was a colonel, and you were a lieutenant, captain. What's your sense of that from further down the ranks?
I echo what he said.
Yeah.
And I'll say this: General Croson was my division commander.
Oh, okay.
3rd Infantry Division in Germany.
Oh, okay.
So he's an old soldier.
The
old dog-faced soldier.
Oh, I mean he.
But and that's kind of what I was saying earlier on. When I was talking about the helicopter pilots.
Mm-hmm.
Earlier on, they would come out and do whatever. Yeah. Later on, and plus you had the protests back home. You had the soldiers who were, quote, not. I mean, they were drafted in. They didn't want to go. Hell no, I don't want to go. So you had earlier on, we were all, we'd been in there a while for the most part. Like I say, I'd been with the division for 2 years and trained hard and kind of knew what we were doing. And then we got some good training in Germany, and then of course went to Vietnam. So yeah, I would echo what he said. He's right on. This is
I'm curious. You had him as a divisional commander back.
Yeah.
What years were?
I would have been. I was with the 3rd Infantry Division in 76 to 78. I was down in the battalion. I was battalion XO, and he was the division commander. I'm
curious. What was he like as a division commander?
Oh, he was hard, but good.
Yeah, I mean, he strikes me as.
He was a soldier.
Yeah.
And that's how he approached things. We go to the field. We're going to the field to train. We're going to go to soldier. And he was for the truth. I think, I may be wrong, I think he came up through the ranks.
Oh, he pretty much did.
But one thing I do know about him, and he said, and he told us this one day in a big officer meeting, he had all the officers together. He says, he said, I have commanded at every level in the 3rd Infantry Division, from platoon leader up to division commander. And that's pretty significant when you think about it. I mean, to start out, all the different commands but in the same unit, through his career. But interestingly, he had, at that time, he had 2 assistant division commanders. One who General Elfin became assistant Chief of Staff of the Army, I guess, 2 or 3 stars. And another one called Charles W. Dyke, D-Y-K-E. You talking about somebody that was hard as woodpecker lips. Was Charles W. Dyke. He was a 1-star general, OCS guy. And he was a soldier. And just amazing what he could, I mean, I don't know if he ever slept.
Mm-hmm.
And he was always everywhere. But one of the things he would do, of course, he was sitting up there, he was assistant division commander for training. And he would know what every unit was doing every day, and supposedly every hour. Woe be unto you if he came into your unit and he pulled out the training schedule and you weren't doing dismounted drill or you weren't doing whatever at the time you were supposed to be doing. I mean, he was death on that. And of course, everybody knew that, so we said, man, you better be. But one of the biggest things he would do, and his aide did not know until the morning, he'd call the aide and say, okay, get the chopper crank. We're going to go have PT with, 2nd Battalion, the 30th Infantry. That was the battalion I was with. And he would just show up. And again, if you weren't in PT formation, woe be into your battalion commander. Because, I mean, he would just eat him alive. But he would come out and he would do PT with you. I mean, he was tall, slim guy. He was probably in his 40s, I guess.
He would be out there.
Oh, he would, and we would take off running, and we'd go through your, the daily dozen or whatever. He'd go right along with you. We'd take off on the run, and whoever was in charge of the formation, like myself or the sergeant, so he'd say, I'm going to take charge of the run. He says, that okay? I mean, of course, everybody, yes, sir. What is you the man? And he would tell you, he said, no, we're going to run my pace. And he did not run a hard pace. I mean, he ran a good, steady pace. And inevitably, in any formation you run, you're going to have some that are going to drop back. Because, I mean, he'd take off, and here we go. And after about 3 miles, there'd be some stragglers. You didn't wait for him to catch up. You circled, and you went back, and you picked them up. And you do that about twice, and I mean, hell, you're having to run, I mean, you're going out, and you said, man, when are we going to go back to the, to the cantonment area? And he'd go back and circle them up. And about the 3rd time doing that, you'd carry these guys. You had to keep them up with the formation. And he'd take you back in finally. We'd stop, and he'd say, well, okay, I'm going to give you a critique on the run today. He wouldn't even be breathing hard. And he'd say, we do not leave our soldiers on the battlefield. Hence, we do not leave them in a PT run. I mean, that was his point. And, of course, everybody knew that was going to be made, but he made it every time he came out for a PT session. And then he'd say, good run today, and he'd jump on his chopper and fly away. But to show you how his whole, thing operated, he was assistant division commander, and he was also a community commander. Over in Germany, you had this different setup. Well, he was a community commander in Schweinfurt. My wife got a speeding ticket. And it happens. I mean, you're out in Germany, and it comes down through command channels, And you, as the sponsor, have to make sure that, hey, your wife or whomever, knows that they, speed here in Germany. Well, in any event, I get this letter down through chain of command that shows, your wife has received a speeding ticket, blah, blah, blah. Well, General Dyke saw everything like that came through the community because he was community commander. Well, he had written down on the bottom of it, George. I mean, I was a tank commander, he says, George, I know what you're going through. Ms. Dyke receives a speeding ticket last week or something like that. And I forget exactly how he ended it up. And he'd write his initials, Charles W. Dyke, CWD. But now he took the time to say, hey, I understand, Ms. Dyke got one of these too. So he was that kind of, he was hard, but at the same time he could be very personal, I guess you'd say.
Well, it's sort of interesting because this totally fits the image I would have of Grossen as a commander. And this makes it with just describing his assistant. Yeah, that
Grossen was
because I once when he spoke at Rutgers, he spoke to I had him do an alumni talk, and I'd sort of had a little bit too much to drink at
well,
the dinner.
yeah.
So afterwards, after his talk and question and answer, I sort of said to him, I said, General, you would be one of the few people, if you basically threw me a weapon right now, I'd follow you. Where for some people I'd interviewed, I had the complete opposite. How far can I get away from you? But Croson just struck me as a general's general, a soldier's soldier.
He called himself the dog-faced soldier, and of course, the 3rd Infantry Division has the song, the dog-faced soldier.
By the way, I should say, even on the record, I mean, his interview is on the web.
Okay.
And his World War II, I mean, we spent a lot of time documenting his Rutgers experiences, and then he was in his, I think it was his company, he said, every junior officer in the battle for France and Germany, except for him, either got wounded or killed. And he said at one point, I mean, the story that really stuck with me is he said, standing in a doorway at one point, there was machine gun fire came through. The guy standing next to me lost his arm from this fire. I was, fortunately not scratched.
Yeah.
But I thought, you've been through that. You've had your.
That's like one of my NCOs got his earlobe shot off. Now, you think about that.
Yeah, that's.
And he was and complained, rightly so, shot earlobe off. I said, Sarge, an inch to the left, and we wouldn't be talking right now.
Yeah.
Yes, sir, you're right. I said, well, I mean, that is tough to get your earlobe shot off. That's getting close.
I'm curious, when you first joined the Army, and then, I guess, who do you think your enemy was, or would be?
Well, of course, back then, the Cold War.
Yeah, so it was the Russians.
So it was the Russians. But, interestingly enough, after I was at Fort Benning, Georgia, 2nd Infantry Division, and we went on this rota plan deal, a 6-month swap out. The battle group would come and take our place, and we'd go and take their place. And we went over to Bomb Holder, the armpit of the world. We used to laugh about him. It's cantonment area there in Germany, Bomb Holder, Germany, 8th Infantry Division. We were able to make some trips up to the front lines, and we were able to go into, and this was right after the Berlin Wall had really gone up in, 61?
Yeah.
So this was in 62. 62, the fall of 62. Well, the Bay of Pigs was, the Cuban, not the Bay of Pigs, but the Cuban missile crisis was going on, is we were getting on planes to go to Germany in October of 62.
So you very well thought this could really...
we did. I mean, we knew we were supposedly going to Germany. That was our, that at the same time, our division was one of what they call the Garden Plot divisions, which was the plan for defense against invasion by Cuba. So we didn't know. We said, man, are we going to Florida? Where the hell are we going? So we jumped on the plane. Well, we ended up in Germany because it was just too much already in motion because they were already coming back, the other unit. We just kind of swapped. But... lost my train of thought there.
Well, you were saying, I asked you about your enemy and who you thought of.
Okay, so we got into Germany and we made these tours up along the border, and we got into East Berlin, or got into West Berlin actually, and then we took a very controlled trip through Checkpoint Charlie over in East Berlin, and then came back in dead of winter, cold, snow everywhere, and the grandmothers were out there sweeping the snow up in the East Berlin area, and we got back, and after I left Germany. And we came back to the States, I started, I don't think they'll ever attack us.
Really? That was your thought at the time? Why did you think that?
When you saw East Berlin, and I did a paper on it when I was in the Czech language school, daylight and dark. West Berlin, East Berlin. And it was daylight and dark. I mean, you go out of West Berlin, it was booming. Things had been built back. You go to East Berlin, they still hadn't been built, and this was in 62, or early 63, I guess, had not been rebuilt. And of course, I was privy to some intel, and you say, I just don't think they've got the wherewithal to come across. And then later on, even more particularly when we got into, I got into 3rd ID, and I was out there again on the what we call the LDA, local deployment areas, and really got in some intel then when I got up to the USRA headquarters in the G3 shop, and I'd go over and listen to the G2, the intel briefings every morning. I mean, if they moved the Jeep, we knew it.
Yeah, yeah.
And I said, there's no way they're going to be able to mass their forces without us knowing it. And plus, you know, by this time, some of the chinks in their armor were starting to come out that they didn't have the, you know, the wherewithal to sustain. And I just never felt, you know, that they were ever going to be a threat to us.
That it was realistic that one day
Yeah.
you're going to wake up and they're
Yeah.
attacking and
Yeah.
yeah.
But even earlier on, after that first tour
Even
of Germany,
whereas a lot of people, I mean, the
But-
Berlin crisis was a major.
oh yeah, but still, you couldn't, you know, not prepare.
Yeah, yeah,
As they say at Leavenworth, you can prepare for war and peace.
yeah.
I think it's my.
But you thought that the chances are not as high as.
I didn't, I didn't think our threat, and I just said, I just don't think that they're going to have the wherewithal to sustain much.
Well, and in some ways,
And
it's
it's-
striking how much it was a facade because, I mean, particularly the first Iraq War, the stuff was junk. I mean, when
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
I mean, I was sort of stunned at how.
Well, I was surprised at 100 hours and it was over with.
Yeah.
And then, of course, this friend of mine, General Lutz, Joe Lutz, who I worked with in Vietnam, and I called him and he said, you know, he was 2-star when he retired. And he said, George, we shouldn't have let them go home with their, you know, he kind of used the Civil War analogy. He said, we let them go home with their mules. He said, we should have turned left and gone to Baghdad.
Yeah.
And of course, that's hindsight too, but that we should have at that point. But our mandate, if I understood it correctly, was get them out of Kuwait and reestablish, and then, you know, that's it. So,
When did I think it was Norman Schwarzkopf who he once said in a talk about when he got out of the West Point, he never I think he was giving an address even to it was in his memoirs. He said, you know, when I got out of the West Point, I never expected to be deployed to these places, Vietnam.
yeah.
He listed several, you know, Iraq, Kuwait. When you sort of were in the Army, I mean, where did you ever expect to end up in a place like Vietnam, for example?
I said, you know, Europe is where we'll go, because I got into the Special Forces and went there initially. And then, of course, by then Vietnam was starting to heat up a little bit on the horizon. But earlier on, I would have never thought I'd been in Southeast Asia fighting a war. I thought it was going to be Europe. But, like I say, after that first rotoplan tour of 6 months there, even in the back of my mind, I said, I don't know that we're going to have a war in Europe. You know, there might be some police actions or stuff. And I never was really, I you know, studied a little bit about Korea, but I never really even considered that would be a situation, because by that time South Korea had really become the stronger of the two, and of course we had our forces still there, so Korea was never, but no, Vietnam was never a, you know, and of course when it started cranking up, I started reading Bernard Fall and a few of those to see what had really gone on over there with the French.
I'm curious, it's very hard to, I think, one of the things I hope people do is think back what they thought at the time. Because I know in hindsight has been...
What you are is where you
well,
are.
yeah, or, you know, people, or as I like to say is, you know, it's hard to admit you might have been wrong. You know,
yeah, well, it sounded like I knew everything was going to happen.
Yeah, but I'm curious, what were your thoughts, you know, when it was clear that Vietnam was heating up and that you were going, what did you think of this all? And you said you started reading up. What were your initial thoughts, not later on, because...
Well, of course, apprehension.
Yeah.
You know, hey, they're shooting real bullets over there. But at the same time, I felt like I had received some, you know, good training. And I knew I was going over, quote, as a young captain. I knew I was going to the 5th Special Forces, but I had no idea for where I was going to end up, or, you know, what I would run into when I got there. And I remember the first briefing I had, or first interview or whatever, with the group commander. I guess maybe it's the deputy commander, anyhow. And there were 3 of us, 3 captains standing there. He said, well, we're going to send you guys down to 3 Corps. Well, you know, 3 Corps didn't make any sense. I don't want to go 3 Corps. What are you talking about? He said, yeah, it's down near Saigon. So we need to get you down there, and may get you on out into a camp. Boy, this sounds serious. it really caught my attention. I'd been at the B team, so they sent us to the B team first. And like I said, we had two A teams and a B team, all in the same complex, if you will, this village of Hepwa, because they were getting ready to put the A teams out. Of course, we got there, had been there maybe a week, still trying to sort out what's going on. And of course, the old guys had been there, and they'd been running operations and stuff. Well, I remember, just like yesterday, the captain came in, and he said, company whatever is taking out a patrol. And it was one of the Vietnamese companies. And he said, we don't have Americans with them. They don't have contact. They don't have communications. So this is an operation they just, the counterpart decided he wanted to run. And he was complaining to the B team commanders, the lieutenant colonel. And he said, they're heading out, kind of gave a general direction, says, I don't know what the hell he's going out there for. So we don't have any intel. I mean, he was kind of, berating the fact that this guy just decided to do this on his own, or send out this about a company-sized force, I guess, or maybe, half a company, 2 to 40, 50 people. And I'd say 30 minutes later, we hear this tremendous boom. This whoom. It just caught everybody's attention. And, but we had no radio contact. We didn't know what had happened. Landmine, what it was. We didn't know what it was. Well, long story short, here come some runners back, the ones that survived. They came running in, and they were just jabbering, and of course, I couldn't understand a bit of the Vietnamese at that time because I hadn't had the language yet. And they were jabbering and going on, and then, of course, things started stirring, and our counterpart, they started scurrying around. What had happened, this unit was walking single file down a canal, and we found out when we got out and made the assessment, there were 7 105 rounds command detonated as this unit was walking along. And it just blew. And we went out and literally, we got helicopters in. Of course, we secured the area and sent out a sweep to secure it. And went out in helicopters and literally, it sounds, the gore of it, picked up bits and pieces of bodies. Mm-hmm. And put them in body bags and took them back to the camp. And we don't know, and they didn't know how many were on the operation. We don't know how many were killed because there were no Americans with them or anything like that. At that point, I said to myself, this is some serious, some serious business we got here. I didn't consider it funny at the time, but it caught my attention some more from that day forward. I said, man, this is serious. And you don't violate security, you don't violate a lot of rules that they violated. And that's what this captain, I can't even remember his name because he left pretty soon after that. His tour was up. And, that made an impression on me. He said, man, they're asking for trouble. And it was almost like it was set up. Mm-hmm. They got into the killing zone and boy, they just waxed them hard. And it was almost like somebody led them out there.
Yeah.
Really. But like you say, my thoughts going in is just try to, watch what's going on and keep my head down.
How did you feel? Vietnam would become controversial, but I often say to my students, look, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed unanimously in the House. That there was, you read the New York Times in 65, 66, it's actually pretty gung-ho for this. What was your sense about the support for the war, say in 64, 65, 66?
Well, I think earlier on there was, I didn't feel any negative. It was pretty well there, but when the battles and the scenes started arriving, and people have written to this, so it's not like it's profound on my part, but when that all started getting portrayed, evening supper table or dinner table. And then, of course, I think a lot of the protesters were really protesting out of, didn't want their hide rendered unserviceable. I don't think they were protesting the war per se, as they were just my individual situation. That's my view of it. But you could see that turn. I do remember the first time back. And was just, I went home, back to my little hometown, and this is what, this is in '67. Went to a football game. Went up in the stands, and of course I waved at a few people that I recognized. And I just we were at home, and I thought, well, the old team's playing, I'll go down and see what it's all about. No one, not one person, came up to me and said, welcome back.
And these were people you knew?
These were people I grew up with.
And that was in '67.
And that bothered me.
Yeah.
And I get up,
Yeah.
and I thought then, I said, these people don't understand what our troops have gone through. And I thought back on that, and I said, I don't know if they didn't know what to say or how to come up and say, but literally not one person. And not that I was looking for a parade. That was not the point. But I kind of waved some people I recognized, and they kind of waved me, and I really thought that was odd.
And no one was sort of spitting on you or anything, or arguing.
That little situation came later on,
Yeah.
coming through the L.A. airport.
Yeah, but this was mainly just apathy, almost, or
I don't know
partly.
if it was apathy, and I tried to, like I said, I tried to think back on it later on, and I thought, well, maybe they just didn't know how to. And by this time, I know there were other kids from that area that had been to Vietnam, and of course, unfortunately, some folks later on, young soldiers were killed. And of course, my brother was over there, but that was the reaction I got on a Friday night at a football
At a
game.
place where people.
That you would think, and there were people that I knew. So it was kind of a.
It wasn't like these were total strangers.
No. Now, like I say, coming through the L.A. airport later on, I guess after my second tour, I had one of these long-haired hippies come up and said something about the baby killer thing.
Yeah.
Because I was in uniform.
Yeah.
And I just grabbed him. And I said, son of a bitch, I'll kill you if you don't get out of my face.
What's interesting because
And he left, and I went on my way.
I asked Vietnam veterans whether they will often tell me stories of having it happen to others, but you're one of the first to actually have that happen.
Yeah, this guy came up to me, and I was not in any mood to.
Yeah.
I was home, and I was relieved, but I was not in any mood. And of course, by this time, this is what, 70, I guess, or whenever the real stuff was really fomenting, and I just wasn't in any mood for that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I killed him or not, but he thought I would.
Well, it's almost 5 o'clock,
Yeah,
so there'll be a part 2. Though it might be a while because I may wait till my graduate assistant. It may be a year because I have a new graduate assistant eventually coming out whose focuses on Vietnam.
Maybe.
But also this will give us